In the last few weeks and months, the Canadian government has been announcing their latest attempt at building a high-speed rail network, and this time, these plans may actually have some promise. This new line, called Alto, would run along part of what's known as the Quebec City to Windsor corridor, which is home to more than half of Canada's population, with the line starting in the country's largest city, Toronto, and then running about 1,000 kilometers to Quebec City, via a number of intermediate stops at Peterborough, the nation's capital, Ottawa, the nation's second largest city, Montreal, Laval, which is basically part of Montreal's metro area, and Trois Rivieres. Now, this is not Canada's first attempt to build high-speed rail, and not even their first attempt to build it on this particular route. But, so far at least, this attempt has seemingly progressed further than any of the previous ones. In just the last few weeks, a whopping $3.9 billion contract has been awarded to start the design phase of the project, with an international consortium named Cadence, which is made up of various companies including SNCF, who operate France's high-speed rail network, winning that contract. This marks the start of what the government is calling the second phase of the project, with the first stage being the procurement stage, which the awarding of this contract has seen completed. This second stage is set to last 5 years or so and will see detailed plans created for the construction of the line, which should then begin in the project's third phase, with the line itself not anticipated to open until at least the 2040s. However, while the line might have progressed further than any of Canada's past high-speed rail attempts, it still has some pretty big hurdles it will need to overcome. So in this video, I'm going to be looking at what this new high-speed line might end up looking like, why it could be so important for Canada, but also what big challenges it will need to overcome in order to actually get built. Hi all, I'm City Moose and I make videos about urbanism and transport, so if that sounds interesting to you, consider subscribing to the channel. I also have a Ko-fi if you want to support me, it is always appreciated. But back to those high-speed rail plans. As I already mentioned, the line will run down the Quebec City to Windsor corridor, which would seem to me like the ideal place to build high-speed rail. It's the most densely populated part of Canada, with around 18 million people living in it, and is home to several of the country's largest cities. Also, if we look at how the population of this corridor is spread out, we can see it forms a rough line, which is very convenient if you want to connect it all up by rail. Now, the area does already have such a rail connection, with existing tracks connecting these population centres that are currently served by various passenger and freight trains. In fact, the passenger services along this corridor account for 96% of Canada's national passenger railway operator, Via Rail's ridership, as well as 4/5 of their revenue. However, despite the lines along this corridor being some of the most used in Canada, they still leave a lot to be desired. For starters, they can be kind of slow. The alignment of these railways are often really old, which limits the potential speed of the trains. At the moment, Via Rail services can reach a top speed of around 160 km an hour, and make the journey between Toronto and Montreal in about 5 hours and 30 minutes. This is quite similar to the amount of time it takes to drive, but a fair bit longer than the time it takes to fly, which only takes a bit over an hour. Now, if high-speed rail is introduced into the mix, it's projected the top speed will be around 300 km an hour, or almost double the existing rail service's top speed. This would mean it could make the journey between Toronto and Montreal in a little over 3 hours, so a fair bit quicker than driving or using the existing train, although still a bit slower than flying. If we look at the full proposed journey of the line all the way between Toronto and Quebec City, we see similar time savings, where driving takes around 8 hours, the current train takes over 9 hours including changing trains in Montreal, flying takes just an hour and a half, while the potential high-speed train could do it in about 4.5 hours. So in essence, the new high-speed line could offer significant time savings compared to driving and the current train service, while being pretty competitive with flying, especially when you account for how much more comfortable trains are when compared to planes, and of course the other time-consuming things flying involves like airport security and just getting to the airport. However, this high-speed rail project will bring more benefits than just speed. It should also help massively with reliability. The current Via Rail service is just not particularly reliable, with service reliability rated at only 67%. A key reason for this is these passenger trains have to share track with freight trains, and because a lot of these tracks are owned by the Canadian National Railway Company, they give their freight trains priority over the passenger ones. The new high-speed rail line would operate on its own dedicated rail track, so in addition to these new tracks being built to allow higher speeds, they will also mean the high-speed trains don't need to share track with freight services, and as a result, it's projected the new high-speed line's reliability will be closer to 95% than the current 67%. So we've already seen that with its population density and shape, the Quebec City to Windsor corridor is well suited to high-speed rail. We've also seen that the existing rail service is already pretty popular, but is being held back by things like slow speeds and poor reliability that high-speed rail could help fix. This all looks pretty positive for the project, but building high-speed rail will come with some challenges. One of the biggest challenges you'll face when building high-speed rail anywhere is how do you get people to the stations? Because unlike with airports, which are typically located relatively outside the city and are generally optimized for people to drive to, high-speed rail stations tend to be built in the city centre. This of course offers a lot of convenience when compared to flying, as the city centre is often the destination of many travellers. But it's also not somewhere you can just build a load of parking lots and have all the travellers drive to. As such, high-speed rail works best when its city centre already has strong transit connections that allow people to get to and from the station using public or even active transport. Thankfully, cities like Toronto, Montreal and Ottawa already have well-established metro, light and commuter rail systems, which are actively being expanded with projects like the GO expansion in Toronto and the REM in Montreal. It will, however, be interesting to see how this is handled in smaller cities like Peterborough and Trois Rivieres, which definitely have less developed transit networks. They could take the Parkway station approach that's often used in the UK, where the station is built a little outside the city with an emphasis on park and ride, but perhaps a better alternative would be to take this opportunity to grow these cities and their transit networks with them. That said, getting people to and from high-speed rail stations is only one of the various challenges this project is set to face. Probably one of the biggest ones is going to be how it was announced. The project was announced a few weeks ago by Justin Trudeau, who was the Prime Minister up until basically a few days ago. And while Canada might have a new Prime Minister from the same party, who has previously expressed support for high-speed rail, he has also promised to rein in government spending, and of course, high-speed rail is never particularly cheap. On top of that, the country will be heading to an election soon, which could potentially result in a change of government, and that could once again put the project on the chopping block. Now, the current government has already signed those $3.9 billion contracts for the project's design phase, and typically these would include some sort of penalty for the government if they decided to cancel them, so perhaps that could provide some encouragement for Canada's next government to see the project through. It does, however, bring me to another major challenge this project faces, which is its costs. I don't expect high-speed rail projects to be particularly cheap, but some of the costs involved in this one are pretty expensive even by high-speed rail standards. For the cost of the design phase alone, $3.9 billion, you could pay for the entirety of some smaller transit projects. For example, Stage 1 of Ottawa's Confederation Line light rail, which was completed in 2019 for the cost of only about $2.1 billion. And this is just for the design. The total cost of the project, including laying the track, buying the trains, etc., is expected to come to about $80 to $100 billion. For a point of comparison, Canada's high-frequency rail project, which was basically the predecessor to this high-speed rail project, was only projected to cost around $6 to $12 billion. The high-frequency rail project would have run along a very similar corridor with very similar stops, but would have had a bigger emphasis on reusing existing rail infrastructure and alignments. Its goal was to allow trains to run more frequently along the corridor and with better reliability, but while it was to bring some speed improvements, it was not going to be true high-speed rail. Now, I would be interested to hear from all of you on whether you think Canada should be focusing on this cheaper but slower high-frequency rail, or whether it's better to go with a costlier but more ambitious high-speed rail project. Personally, while I like the idea of high-speed rail, I do worry its high costs and long build time leave it prone to cancellation, whereas the quicker and cheaper high-frequency rail could still bring a lot of the benefits to things like reliability, service frequency, and even travel times to a lesser extent. But if you agree or disagree, I'd be keen to hear why, so drop a comment below. However, to reduce the costs and build time of the high-speed rail approach, some have suggested breaking it out into stages, with an initial stage just focusing on the Toronto to Montreal section, while a second stage then extends it from Montreal to Quebec City. I could even see a future stage taking the line from Toronto to Windsor via London to fully complete the Quebec City to Windsor corridor. While splitting the line out like this would likely mean certain sections are done later, it would break the project down into more manageable chunks that can be delivered faster and cheaper, reducing the chance of them getting cancelled. Putting the focus on the Toronto to Montreal section initially could also be helpful. It's likely this section will see the highest usage, so by getting it out the door sooner, people will be able to see the success of the line, which should make them more excited about seeing the next stages happen. Ultimately though, I think it's past time Canada took steps to improve the rail transport options in this key part of the country. At the moment there's something like 40 flights a day between Toronto and Montreal alone, which clearly demonstrates there's a lot of demand for travel along this route, but it also highlights the environmental cost of having all of these people choose air travel over rail. Improved rail options, whether that be high speed or just high frequency, can provide a more comfortable, more convenient, and definitely more environmentally friendly way to move between the cities along this corridor. It also has the potential to bring huge benefits to Canada's economy, with the high-speed rail option projected to create some 51,000 jobs, or providing a $35 billion boost to the country's GDP each year. And, because of certain external factors, now is a good time for Canada to be looking at ways to protect its local economy. In my view, of all places you could build high-speed rail in North America, this corridor is one of the more obvious ones, so I think improved rail connections along it are more a matter of when rather than if. But hopefully, with projects like this one, that when could be sooner rather than later. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you want to support the channel, I also have a Ko-fi, I do always appreciate it. And if you want to find me elsewhere, you can find my Instagram on @city.moose and my Twitter/X on @city_moose1. I'm not really doing much with either of those accounts at the moment, but I do plan to start sometime. Regardless, I'm Kyle, aka City Moose, and as always, thanks for watching.